Greetings, I'm Dr. Sharon Moss, President, ASAE Research Foundation. Sound evidence can serve as the basis of well-informed strategic discussions and decision-making. Trade and professional associations have been shown to benefit from using data to drive their organization's mission and impact. To that end, the Research Foundation is bringing to you Research for Impact. This series of virtual programming is designed to help you harness and apply evidence to advance efforts within your industry and the broader society. We invite you to come along with us throughout the month of April to explore how associations gather and use evidence to inform critical decision-making, how trade and professional associations cultivate internal and external support of research, and how associations of varying sizes develop and execute data-driven strategic visions. Now, over the next 3 weeks, we will engage association professionals on a range of topics that address the value and use of data for greater impact. We look forward to seeing you at our upcoming Friday virtual panel discussions and other peer-led chats in Collaborate. On behalf of ASAE Research Foundation, we invite you to sit back or lean into the chat and join us on this first stop along the journey, creating a data-driven organizational culture and using research for impact.
Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Good morning for our friends joining us from the West Coast. I'm Tom Southard. I'm the COO of the Conference of Major Superiors of Men, and I'm excited to be facilitating today's conversation. Thank you for joining for this second event, this first webinar for the Research for Impact Month, brought to you by the Research Foundation of the American Society of Association Executives. These programs are made possible by people like you who join ASAE, who seek out opportunities for professional growth for themselves and their organizations, and who support the Foundation's work. Today, we're going to be discussing good practices in building a data-driven culture in your organization. If you're here, you probably know that data is important, but you might not know how to use it or how to get your colleagues to engage with it. We're going to hear from 4 people who have worked with their organizations, with staffs, boards, and volunteers to create positive transformation towards an evidence-based approach. Joining us today, we have Mike Steckel, Director of the User Experience at Mighty Citizen.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody.
We have Catherine Matthews, the Manager of Data and Analytics at the National Council of Architectural Registration Boards.
Hey, everyone.
Bob London, the Executive Director of Alpha Phi Omega. And Susan Chung, the Vice President of Research and Knowledge at the American Society of Interior Designers. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So I want to start by sharing an experience I had, and then we're going to turn to the panel. I used to be a researcher at the University of Delaware, and we had a prominent association who came to us and said, we would like some research done. And they spent a lot of money to get a very important research project done that we believed had great impact on their work, on both how this association did its work and also the population that it served. We spent about 9 months working on it. We met with a team. We handed over a beautiful, what we considered a beautiful piece of research, which was immediately shelved because the organization had no idea how to use it. They didn't know what to do with it. They didn't know how to engage with it. And they weren't sure how to take our recommendations and share them in a way that they could sell to their board, to their volunteers, even to their staff. It was an embarrassing moment for us. Hopefully it was an embarrassing moment for that association. And it's something that we learned from. And hopefully today we'll be talking about how to make sure that doesn't happen with your associations. They had the data, but they didn't figure out how to implement it. So today, as we get started, we're going to start with one of the conversations we met. This group met a little bit before today, And one of the questions that kept arising was this idea of research being different, having different needs, different resources, different aims, all at different organizations. And we quickly realized that research means very different things, partly based on the readiness of the organization. And Bob London shared with us this idea of a research sophistication index. Bob, can you talk a little bit about that?
Happy to, Tom, and glad to be with everybody. I feel a little bit out of place as I have no background in research or data analysis. I've been with my organization going on 19 years now, and we have just under 20 staff members. So not small according to small associations in ASAE, but still relatively very, very small organization. We have over 350 chapters across North America. And what I believe is you've got to figure out where you are to know how sophisticated you can be. And we can't all start at the very high end. For those of you who are on the call or the discussion Wednesday, and you heard Nicole and Reggie talking about data, and you see all the fancy stuff that Reggie Henry with ASAE can put together, right? That's pretty sophisticated from my position. There are much larger associations that may think that that's not. So a sophistication index may not be the same for everybody, but to know where we are is how we can get started in really moving forward with using data to better our association. And so the story that I shared was when I started some 19 years ago, I walked in, and within the first month, I asked for some information, and our membership database was all in Access, Microsoft's Access product, sorry. And what happened was I couldn't get the same information twice. And in this case, it had to do with our fundraising information. And I was trying to figure out how to cut and chop information so we could raise the most amount of money. And I said, we have no idea what data we have, and we had to make a change. Making that into a really short story, right? We got the board to approve, and we moved to a AMS system. And where we have gotten to today is we are working on a project where we are crunching and harnessing the data in our data warehouse to be able to project with an 80 to 85% certainty what our chapter membership growth is going to be. And this wasn't out of any fancy tool. It was just a gut feeling I had that said, we have enough information here. We should be able to put the factors in and be able to predict where we're going, which is obviously is right one of the three stages of using your data. So we went from not knowing how to cut our membership and how to divide it all the way up to how looking at a predictive model. Now, granted, it's taken a long time for us to get there. We don't have a research department or person on our staff. We don't have a data analyst like some of my colleagues today are, right? But we're finding a way to do this, and it continues to help move our organization forward. We've used it on how we support our groups and our membership, as well as defining how do we take limited resources and apply them for the most return. And we do that by measuring everything that we do and then seeing what those results are. And we try and do it over a period of time or a longitudinal type study. So we know that, especially if we look at this year in the pandemic, how much college campuses are changing, right? That 1 year should not make an automatic change. So that's kind of where I came up with the thought of a sophistication scale, or right, it's really knowing where you are. And to know where we are, that includes the board as well as staff. And sometimes the staff can be a lot easier depending on your staff size. With the board, we tend to take it one step ahead of where they are right now. So we discuss it in bites, always being transparent about the big picture, but making sure we're not trying to move them 4 or 5 steps ahead at one time. We think it's easier to take one step as we go. So that's kind of what we were talking about regarding the sophistication index.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate that idea of kind of this one step at a time to make sure everybody's getting involved. We're definitely going to come back to that board and staff conversation. And we're also going to hear a little bit more about these limited resources, because I don't think anybody says we have unlimited resources. So we're going to talk about why that's going to be important. For now, we're going to turn to Dr. Susan Chung. Susan is the VP of Research and Knowledge for the American Society of Interior Designers. Her first question when we got together was about who the research is for. Susan, can you share your thoughts on this idea of a data-driven culture working in an organization with a big commitment to research, where much of that focus is external?
Right. So thank you for having me. This is a great topic to be discussing. And I love how Bob started off with knowing where you are. And to your question, Tom, it's really looking at the purpose, right? So the American Society of Interior Designers, our vision statement starts with advancing the profession and communicating the impact of design on human experience. And that impact on design really focuses on, okay, where's that research? How do you know that you're making an impact, a positive impact through the design for positive human experiences? So as Tom had mentioned, we have research at the core of our association, making sure that both internally and externally, we're looking at the data. We're looking at what we have data on our membership, on our members, who they are, what they do, the type of work that they do, their interests, their needs, also looking into how they're engaging with us as an association. What resources are they looking towards? What resources are they requesting? Also, how are we using our marketing and communications to really get to them? And is that the best way to do that? So each department within our association really has certain data points that they follow. And they look at our team, the research and knowledge team, to also help them to support that. So beyond the typical or the basic data points that they gather on their own, we at our research team look to support them with additional data points. That could be through member surveys, that could be through ad hoc surveys, post-event surveys, etc. But the other point that we like to focus at our association is that external piece as well. So one part is we do have an advocacy team, and for them, it's to understand, okay, what data is there beyond our association that's within government and other sources that can really advocate for our profession. Another external source is looking into, okay, what can we supply our designers so they can meet with their clients to do the best work possible. I'd mentioned again, the vision statement that we have is really centered on how design makes an impact on human experience. And that is very centered on a core belief that design is based on evidence. So this evidence-based design piece takes research that supplies evidence that informs design solutions, which becomes evidence-based design that has been part of the interior design practice for a numerous number of years. And for that, we like to close that loop. So it's not just the evidence that leads into design solutions, but it also ends with, so what? Right? So now that you have the design, do you also have the research that provides additional evidence that validates the evidence that you started with, or provides additional evidence so other design projects can use for their own projects as well? So we'd like to have that to be a closed loop. To get to that, that external research, that evidence-based research in design, one example is even how we led this example for our interior designers through the design of our headquarter office. So the ASID headquarters, located in Washington, DC, we conducted a post-occupancy research, meaning that a pre and post-occupancy research, meaning that we did research prior to moving in and designing our office, but also after occupancy, to make sure that we had the evidence that fed into the design, but from that design also tested to see that the evidence informed the design and closed that loop. So more information on this can be found on the ASAE Centennial Research case study. For more information, I believe the link will be included in the chat box there. But this is a great tool for us to use our own workplace research to communicate that to our members and saying, here's a best practice example of what evidence-based design and having outcomes from that design to better their practice in their work. And all of this, it comes from really just basic questions that I'm sure everyone is very well versed in. It's the who, what, when, where, why, and how. So going through each of those questions and understanding really what is the question that you have, who is it for? And that could be for the board, it could be for the members, it could be for different stakeholders, it could be for the clients of your members, etc. Understanding the what, so what is the question that you have and what are you investigating, but also leading into the why, right? Why are you doing this? What's the rationale? And I'd like to add towards the end that so what question. You can have these questions, you can do the research, you can have the data, but to Tom's story at the very beginning, if you don't know how to use that data or how that data informs next steps, then you're kind of at a loss. So that activation piece, that so what piece is also a very important question to go through.
Thank you so much, Susan. I love the so what. I think we often stop, right? We go through all those questions and we forget to ask, what are we actually going to do with it? And I'm grateful for your sharing that. I also love the evidence, I cannot get over it, the evidence-based research, the design, right? Because we're so used to evidence-based research, and to put that into design in serving external clientele is so important. And I think it's something that we often don't do. So thank you for that. We're probably going to come back to that a little bit as we have some conversation at the end. And next up, we're going to hear from Catherine Matthews. Catherine Matthews is from the National Council of Architectural Registration Boards. Susan is an interior designer by profession who has become a researcher. Catherine is an experienced researcher who's going to talk about how that research impacts the direction and the work of the organization. Catherine?
Yeah, so it was interesting when we got picked to be on the panel. I was like, oh, we're kind of in, sort of sibling fields, really, which is always fun. I feel like I'm not meeting enough new people, while we're all in this pandemic phase. So it's nice to make some new friends. But to the topic at hand. So yes, I actually am very fortunate when I started at NCAR. It was a very analytically mature organization, and especially in terms of the systems. We had data warehouse, we had a robust public-facing annual research project. We had 2 data scientists on staff. So we had all of the technical pieces, all of the infrastructure, and actually Susan used the word activation. We hadn't had it really sort of like catch on or stick amongst our staff. And so as we're kind of moving into what I'm calling data 2.0 at NCAR, we're focusing on a 2-pronged approach. One is taking this fabulous infrastructure that we have and building upon it, iterating on it. How can we start putting together more advanced analytics? How can we start turning assets, more of our assets to be either public or member or stakeholder facing, so that we're sharing data, not just stockpiling it, hoarding it. And also, how can we improve staff data literacy and comfortability working with data so that they feel confident going in under the hood in a report and kind of moving this, that, or the other around and answering their own questions. We want to be a partner for all of the different research and initiatives that our teams have. We also don't want to be an impediment. We want people to feel confident that they can work independently on at least, most of the basic data related tasks, and then bring us in as a partner for more advanced questions. So I think data teams are kind of always building the plane as we fly it. We're just increasingly building bigger and bigger planes.
That idea of letting people learn how to use the data is so important, because so often one group hoards it and then doles it out where it's helpful. And I think that's a huge different way that a lot of people aren't doing things. So thank you for that. And that actually leads us very naturally into Mike. Mike Steckel's the director of the user experience at Mighty Citizen. He's all about, even from his title, you can tell, the user experience. So Mike, as we've talked a lot about data and culture, so now we're getting this data, we're trying to change the culture. What are we doing?
Yeah, well, first of all, I am thrilled to be here. This is a fantastic topic, and I'm a huge fan of ASAE. So I want to just thank everyone for letting me even participate. But when we're talking about data and culture, there's a lot of things that we see at Mighty Citizen. We're a consulting agency, so we deal with a lot of different organizations who use data in all kinds of different ways. So I thought it might be useful to kind of pull out a few things that I kind of come back to when talking with clients about how they use data. And one of them, what I originally wrote down, was a little skeptical of certainty. And Susan mentioned evidence-based design, and this is really just a variation of that. But it comes back to, how do we know what we think we know? You'd be surprised at how often we ask clients questions and they talk about how their members love this resource or that event. And when we say, how do you know that's true? They don't always have an answer. So a little bit of skepticism around certainty is, I think, a pretty good entry point. Another thing that we've heard from other panelists was interdepartmental. So when you talk about not hoarding data, we want to be sure that we're sharing our data across departments within your association. Your users think of your association as one big thing. And sometimes, like, the membership team maybe isn't talking enough to the education team. And we want our data to kind of mirror the way your users see you. So sharing your data across your different departments is really important. And a related one is interdisciplinary. People from marketing think differently than people who are visual designers, but both can really learn from each other when they talk about the data that they are seeing. So it can be really important to talk across your disciplines and across your departments. A big thing you can do to improve your data culture is just to get to know people in the rest of the organization and get a feel for what they know, because you're kind of putting all that research in a bank. And when you have a project, you can pull that data out and share it as a great input to whatever you're working on. And finally, as Tom said, I'm big on the user. You want to be sure you're looking not only at quantitative data, but qualitative data. Try to merge them together so that you get a sense of what is happening, say, on your website or within your ads or wherever it might be, but also why. What problems are users having? When you see qualitative and quantitative working together, it can be really powerful. So if you think about how to make your data consumable, given this sort of culture, one of the things that we always try to say is to show your data in a story fashion as a system. So a number in isolation doesn't really have a lot of interest. You really need, it's like a character without a story, maybe. It's difficult to really understand how that piece of data connects to the rest. So we usually would recommend that people either have a compare year over year or month over month, or to show their data in a series or a path so they see the context. So from a quantitative perspective, you might show number of visits to the homepage from search or from advertising or from cross promotions. And then from that, how many click on become a member, how many complete the form, where do the numbers change at each step? And then on top of that, if you can show some real users who are, say, going through your form, you start to understand also where they might be getting confused. Do they understand the error messages? Are they comfortable adding their phone number? Because maybe they're worried you're going to start bothering them all the time with texts. And if you present that data as a set, it's a very compelling story. And you pull the rest of the organization in. So this will not only give your data a bigger impact, and you can avoid some of the issues that we've had with data sitting on shelves. We've all experienced that. But it creates better conversations with your staff. And those better conversations are really the heart of a strong data-driven culture.
Thank you, Mike. I think that sets us up well for a lot of the questions we got. I would be remiss, I have been remiss, I'm sorry, to remind everyone, if you have questions, we have the Q&A box in the bottom. We already have a few people who have asked. Please feel free to ask any questions you have. I also see some robust chats going on, and I'm really glad for those to continue. I'm sure all of us are watching all sides of the screen, trying to see everything that's coming in. So I'm going to invite all of our panelists back in. And we're going to have a little bit of an open discussion. And we're going to start with a question that came in advance. And this was a question about, in professional associations, member engagement is, and this is a phrase that I think we need to unpack a little, a non-financial ROI, return on investment, that needs to be understood. What are your methods for identifying, measuring, monitoring, and responding to non-financial measures of success? Bob, I'm going to cue that up for you.
Sure. So I think that they all are financial measures of success. Some are direct and some are indirect. So member engagement can be direct or indirect. So if we know that certain data is helping us make better decisions, those usually turn around to increased member satisfaction or increased finances, and increased member satisfaction improves our retention. So that would be an indirect financial return on investment. So I think there's both. I think it's always financial. In my view, it's either direct or indirect.
Susan, I'm going to ask you, we talked about this idea of financial and its member investment. You're really also doing data for the profession, which is pretty big, right? For a lot of us, it's how do we move forward our association and the work we're doing. Yours is a little more external. Can you speak a little bit about that, the investment that your association thinks is going into it?
Sure. I mean, when you think about externally for the profession, similar questions or similar inquiries come on this as well. It's not member engagement, but perhaps it's client engagement for our members. We oftentimes hear that, okay, with evidence-based design, how do you get to create the business case that you can deliver to the clients on why interior design is important? In order to get to that, that loop becomes essential once more. You can do the evidence-based design and provide it, but if you don't support it with additional data that came from the design product, then you're missing out on that loop to really see if that design succeeded or not. And how you define success and how you measure success could be very different depending on the client's priorities, the client's definition, etc. But really it gets into, okay, what are you really trying to measure? Like, really, what is success? What are you trying to measure, and how can you measure it? It really is a guidance question of deciphering really what you mean about those metrics, and do you have the resources to measure what you really want to measure?
Thank you. And I'm going to stay in this for just a moment, this idea of kind of investment. What, and this is open to everyone, what should you be investing in to move to this idea of a data-driven culture? For some people, it's relational. For some people, it's staff. So as you're looking at your experiences, where should organizations be considering investing?
One thing that I think would be a valuable starting place is to try to create a vision for what you want your members to experience when they encounter you. It's behaviors. What behaviors do you want to see in your members that help you reach your organizational goals? And then you can design back from those behaviors going forward. Behavior is kind of really what we're talking about. I mean, a lot of our metrics are really proxies for human behavior change. And so in a way, I think that's a really good starting place. We want our users to be able to do these things easily, and then you can build your websites and your measurements around, are we achieving those goals?
Great. Catherine?
I was going to say, I know I'm biased, but I think every organization should at least strongly consider investing in a full-time staff member who's dedicated to doing data, doing research, helping with these things. But a less biased answer, I think, one of the things that keeps people from using their data or going into these sorts of projects can be the quality of the data, the cleanliness, the trustworthiness, is it really solid enough for us to draw conclusions from? And it can be very daunting if, when the answer is no, your only solution to use it is to then pour hours, weeks, months, years, eternities into cleaning it up. So I think if you can focus on, invest in integrating that data quality, that data health life cycle into your day-to-day or your project-to-project, and keep your data clean on a consistent basis, it's going to kind of reduce that barrier to entry when you come up with a really good question to ask it. I think sometimes folks can get very discouraged when there's this negative feedback cycle of, I have a question, I can't answer it. I have a question, I can't answer it. So setting yourself up for success when you get there is important.
Thanks, Catherine. When you said that, a full-time staff member, I think knowing I'm involved in the small staff community of ASAE, I'm sure half of people here gasped and said that's not going to happen. So as you all look at smaller associations who might not be able to afford a full-time staff member, there was a question that was asked about, we're looking at range of costs for hiring a data consultant, identifying the system, circulate an RFP, help to set up and integrate the systems. Obviously, costs are going to vary, but as people are looking into that, what should they be considering? If somebody's looking at their data and they're saying, I know that we've collected information, but we have no idea what to do with it, or we'd like to collect information one day. How do we get started in that? Even if it's not cultural change, just activity change.
I would say, if you've never watched your members or potential members use your website or use your sign up for an event, start there. Because that will drive a lot of the other things that go along with that. That will tell you right away, are they having a good experience or a bad experience? It'll tell you where you're strong and where you need to invest more time. And it might even help you understand how to staff up. But if you've never done it, it's not expensive. And it just brings worlds of new information that is sitting right in front of you. And it keeps you focused on what's good for our membership. And you're definitely not going to go wrong if you stay focused on what our members want. So I don't know if anybody would agree with me on that, but I think that's a really good place to start. That way you're not measuring the wrong thing.
I would say there's 3 approaches to doing research. One is based on what questions you have. And mainly those questions come from observations. You see what's going on and you have this curiosity spark up and you ask that question. But another way to do research is you have the data. You have these seas of data, but you don't know what to do with it. But you can look at the data and start saying, okay, what patterns do I see from this? And then you can extract a research question from that. The third approach is looking at methods. So say, for example, you have an event and you have the opportunity to do a post-event survey. But okay, then what do you do from there? What questions do you ask? Or what data do you need? Or what's your objective going forward? Do you want to continue that event? Or are you looking to see what the value is or how to refine it? That triggers, from that opportunity, that triggers what questions that you can ask as well. So there's different ways to approach how you go into looking at your data and what you want to invest in. The other part to the question that came up on investment, I would say invest in time, and that could be a staff member. It'd be awesome to have a staff member. If not, then the time that you spend at the beginning of a project or a program, the very beginning, I would say it becomes an opportunity for you to ask the questions, set it up for what you define as success, but also end it with those questions as well. Revisit the questions you asked at the very beginning so you have those metrics at hand. You can definitely check in between as well if you have that time, but I would say invest in time at the very beginning and at the end to make sure that you're covering the questions and you have something to validate it at the end.
Thank
So
you.
I would just love that, Susan. I would just add to it two things. One would be that not just time at the end, but time at the end and ask not what we did, not just what we did, but what's next is part of that, number one. And then number two, for those who are just trying to get moving in this direction, move, right? You may not get it right, but starting helps with that culture. You know, some of us have to learn by doing because of other factors, staff size. You know, we can't all, unfortunately, have Catherine on our staff, et cetera. So, you know, it's just start and you'll be moving in the right direction.
I love that, Bob. That's really good. Just get going. One of the things that we also often recommend is to test a lot of little things. Kind of always have little tests running that are usually tied to your strategic objectives as a company. And if you haven't started anywhere, it's best to kind of think about what the people at the top of the organization care about, which is how do we get more members? How do we get more money from the members we have? How do we use technology and data to save money? You know, these big questions are a really good place to start thinking about because they rally the whole organization together. And the closer your data is tied to your strategic objectives as an association, think about how your CEO looks at your whole company, the more relevant the data will be, and the more likely it is to actually be used and engaged with.
Mike, a very specific question that came in.
Yeah.
You talked about this idea of how people can engage, how people can test how visitors engage with their website, registration, others. Are there tools that you would recommend on that? We've had a few that have come through, Crazy Egg, Hotjar. I love these names. That is not the name of one, that's what I'm saying. Mike, anything else?
It depends on what you're really trying to see. So like there are things like, you know, eye tracking software that will kind of watch where people's eyes go, you know, when they're filling out a form, and that can be useful, but I wouldn't start there. I really would start with much more simple, watch, ask questions, and observe. As far as qualitative information, and then try to like just pull out little things that you notice that you can test, that you can discuss with people in other departments and with people who think differently than you do. And I would really build on those easy things first before I start investing in tools, because the tools can sometimes, they can be really useful, but they can also kind of, we buy a tool to keep us from doing some of this other kind of work that's maybe a little more difficult for us as an organization to do. And it won't really solve our problems if we don't get our strategy right as we go in. We might be paying for things that we don't need as well.
Thank you. Good to know. So another question that came up as you approach research, and I think we've all started to address this a little bit, do you generally approach it on an as needed basis? Here is a project, we're going to figure it out. Or do you kind of create a research agenda over a given period of time that you're now going to try to tackle? I'm going to take a guess in an answer in the way, so it's a little bit of both because you have to, but let me ask the next question, which is how do you balance that? You don't just chase every project, but also, you know, the time to create an ambitious research agenda can be challenging.
So Tom, I think it depends on really where you are and what your resources are to really answer that question, right? I think that it definitely is both. However, I think for some of our smaller organization, it starts on the first option, right? You know, as we need it. But then if you just start thinking about data, what data do we have and what stories is it telling us? I think you move into being more research focused. okay, now that I know I have A, how do I get a picture, or I have A, B, and C, how do I get a picture of the alphabet? And so I think it moves you in that direction.
Polly, I'm going to highlight something Polly said, which addresses that. Very often, good research leads to excellent follow-up questions. Often, once you start researching, hopefully your natural curiosity takes over. And all of a sudden, you're looking up things that you didn't know you should be looking up. Your world becomes a little bit different. Catherine, do you want to add to this?
I'm nodding and smiling because as a data person, like the only bad response when I present something is for someone to say, "Oh, okay," and not have a follow-up question. You know, like I want them to have feel challenged by it, have a new question, have a new area of exploration. So yeah, I mean, I think you always want to be engaging, and I think actually it's where the evidence-based design, we can really apply that inward, right? Like when we're presenting our work, our findings, our visualizations, whatever the case may be, you know, how are people engaging with it? How are they interacting with it? What are they asking to get out of it? And how do we feed that back into that feedback loop, so that we're consistently delivering better information in better ways to our audience? Yeah, I think you're always iterating.
Our next question, I'm going to ask Susan and Catherine to address a little bit. As they're setting up research agendas, what are we considering in whether we're looking at inward, outward, serving members, serving the organization, which then serves members, serving the profession? It's going to be different for everybody, but there's a lot to consider in how you move down that. Can you each speak a little bit to the processes, it might have been before you got there, that went into setting up the research agendas for your organizations?
Susan, if you'd like to go first. I'm sure you've got probably more expansive things to say.
I don't know about that, but sure, I can start off. We recently went through a strategic planning session, and recently, meaning more than a year ago, but it's been ongoing because, of course, COVID hit and disrupted, and we need to refine it, continue, and pivot along the way. But in determining the research agenda and what we wanted to do, I mentioned we do research internally and externally. A lot of the internal focus pieces are somewhat recurring. We know what we have, we know what we're interested in. The data that we collect isn't just a rinse and repeat fashion, but it does get into, okay, how do we better refine this? What's the next level? But when we get into the external pieces, it really gets into, okay, what's needed now? And COVID has been a great example in saying that, okay, we didn't expect COVID to happen. We didn't know this was going to happen, but it was a great opportunity for us to pivot and really address, okay, what do our members need now, right? What do they need now, and what can we provide them? So looking at our existing resources, how can we pivot so we can follow to serve them in a way during this climate? But the other part to the research agenda is really going back to that strategic plan and making sure that we're mapping everything to it. The research, I mean, I constantly come out of meetings with a full list of to-dos, full with a list of wish lists of, I want research on this. And it's hard to determine, okay, how do you prioritize this? Like everything seems to be very important. Everything, of course, is very urgent, but how do you prioritize it? And what do we have the bandwidth to do it? I think it gets back into what are our guiding principles, going back to our vision statement, going back to our strategic plan, understanding we can't do everything all at once, but what can we do right now? And it also acknowledging that it's not just the research team that does this, but it is the entire association. We can collaborate with each other, and we can also collaborate with other partners outside of our organization as well. So understanding and being creative in that process, but placing these pillars in place to understand how to bring that research agenda forward is some examples recently that we've been implementing.
I will just +1 everything you said, and I would add that one of the nice things about research and data work that faces external audiences, so whether it's members or the general public or any other group, is that once you've announced that you're going to do something, you're kind of you're held accountable to that timeline. It's a lot easier to apologize to a few coworkers when something is late than it is to apologize to, you know, thousands of members or something like that. So a little sprinkle of accountability sometimes comes in handy with those external facing projects.
Just as far as getting a research program started, one thing that can be useful as far as like a question that the organization can wrestle with a little bit is, if our association is incredibly successful, how will that change the life of our members? That's a good sort of framework that you can start building out of. And it's a really good way to just kind of start having some conversations with your staff about what that would actually look like. I mean, you know, how are they perceived within their own organizations? You know, how is their life different and better because of their involvement with you?
Mike, I'm going to use that to lead into the next question, which I'm going to ask you and Bob to address. To what degree, the question came from Polly, to what degree and how are you involving your members and your volunteer leaders in defining your research agenda and the full lifespan of your research? And that's kind of from the idea of what are we studying to how are we disseminating it, who are we sharing it with? I appreciate what somebody said, which is a lot of times we get scared, we don't have the right data, so we just hide everything. You know, how are we making sure that we're involving all the right stakeholders in this conversation?
So I think it's a balance, number one, and it actually ties into, you know, what Susan was saying. And if you don't have that research department or research staff member on your staff, right, one of the challenges is not getting pulled into rabbit holes just because a key volunteer is interested in something. So a board member who says, oh, wouldn't it be nice to know X? But if it doesn't tie into all those, the vision, the mission, your strategy, et cetera, right, you're wasting a lot of resources. So I think it is important, and it's to Polly's question, I think it's important to work on your culture. And in doing so, your board has to buy into your culture or you'll never get there. And if your board buys into it, then I think you are transparent. I think you do things like focus groups and as simple as surveys and in different aspects. As we're trying to do better with DE&I, we're doing a very in-depth survey and focus group of some of our members of color and trying to learn better so we can be better. And so I think there's different ways if you understand your membership and your segments within your membership.
Yeah, that's fantastic. One other thing that's been helpful for us is to be sure that the board or the decision makers buy into the research question. And sometimes if we make that its own step before we start the research, we can avoid some of the what if curiosity kind of questions that Bob was referring to. So that's another way that we've been able to kind of bring people together, is that we agree on what we're looking at before we actually start the research.
Maybe we can scrub this from the recording afterwards, but I mean, we've all seen Inception, right? Like there's a little bit of that that needs to be done.
Thank you for all of that. I'm seeing some really interesting kind of conversation going. One is this idea about data health being a journey, that every time we get it better, it's better than it was before. So yes, it's going to be an investment of time, but frankly, I'm just going to say it's an investment of time you have to make at some point. And a lot of times, I don't know, I'm sure like many of you, just like Bob, I inherited a really crappy database and we kept saying, we're going to update it. And finally said, no, we just have to do it. We're not going to play around anymore because we need to get better than where we are now. I saw something that was a little bit chilling and an important comment from Michael. Michael said, sometimes non-researchers who attempt to use data are dismissed by knowledgeable researchers because their attempt, it's deemed unworthy or juvenile because it wasn't the quality of research that we're necessarily looking for. You know, how do we move an agenda forward when sometimes that's the critique from the research community? You know, if we don't fully understand research protocols, but we're still trying to do research. And Bob, you in some ways set this up a little at the beginning when you said, I'm not a professional researcher. It's not my full-time job, but we needed to do things. So Bob, I'm going to ask you to speak a little about this. And Susan, as a researcher with a PhD who does this, I'd also like you to address it if you don't mind.
I think it just goes back to that sophistication index, Tom. If you're not very sophisticated, it's much easier to get going and not have those challenges. I think as you get more sophisticated and you're trying to do more, that maybe you do have those challenges from the research quote community. But I think if you're transparent and you work on your culture, you really minimize those. So if I'm bullheaded and I'm pushing it all through and nobody's with me, I'm going to get challenged a lot more than if I'm inclusive and working on my culture and not just trying to do it by myself.
Thank you, Bob. Susan?
I love how Bob used the word transparency, right? With any research article, you want to be transparent in your methodology to understand, okay, how did you do this research? Because that guides you to understand what that data is. With that, then to me, every question is a good question. There are no stupid questions. There are no bad questions. What you get from it, everything is valuable. And there's value in it because you did something, right? If you don't do anything for the sake of, oh, it's not perfect, I'm sorry to say, and you can scrub this out of the transcript as well for any of the peers that disagree with this. But even among scholarly research, nothing's perfect. You'll still be critiqued. Everything ends with future research, more questions. There's no perfect one size fits all. It's about iteration. It's about, okay, how do you take this to the next level? It doesn't have to be high level from the beginning. You can grow up to that. I believe that's the beauty of research. It's the learning process. It's the growth.
The beauty of research. Thank you. I mean, that's what it comes down to. It's how we move it forward. So Sylvia said, stop research shaming. Absolutely. And Nicole said, tackle something, even if it's small, just move forward. The music is about to play, so we're almost to the end of our time together, but I want to do something I didn't tell you I was going to do. I'm going to do a round robin and just ask each of you to say the one takeaway from this, right? With the five of us have had time together. We've talked a few times before this. We've enjoyed these conversations. A lot of good ideas have been taken. What's the takeaway that you would ask people who are watching this to walk away with? And I'm going to start because he unmuted himself first with Mike.
Great. Good question. I would say to use quantitative and qualitative together as a set. It keeps you curious. It keeps you open to new ways of thinking, and it keeps you focused on your members who really drive whether you're successful or not.
Great. Bob?
So not staying directly to the question as you would expect, Tom. My takeaway is this: be involved in communities with researchers and data analysts. I learned so much more, and I'm going to put a quick plug in for the ASA Research Foundation Committee, because I'm on that committee and have had no research background. Not exactly sure why I got selected, but I did. I learned so much from that peer group, as much more than what I give back to it. Being on this panel, all these things, and collaborate, etc. Being in those conversations teaches me so much that I can take little nuggets and add without that full research department to our staff.
Catherine?
Yeah, I think half takeaway, half tip. When we talk about like just get started, one thing that's kind of helpful, especially as you feel like you're making progress along that research sophistication index, is to keep a running list of all the questions you have. And similar to the no research shaming, there are no wrong questions. Put every question on that list and just keep track of them. You may not be able to answer all of them right now. Some of them you might not be able to answer ever. We have our intractable moonshot type questions at NCAR for sure. But keeping an eye on or creating that space for people to raise those questions and having a sort of well to draw from when you're looking for inspiration around a project, I think that can be really helpful.
Thank you. Susan?
I use research as an opportunity to be creative. And by being creative, it's both novel and appropriate. The novel ideas can come from non-researchers. So be open to those opportunities and use this as a brain exercise for everyone. I see this to be a perfect team exercise to gather everyone around, ask questions, and come together to understand really what are everyone's needs and how do we come together to do this.
Thank you. Catherine used the phrase moonshot, and somebody reminded me not that long ago that moonshot is a phrase that didn't exist before we got to the moon, and it meant something now that is very difficult but is still possible. So I think it's the perfect phrase to use because this is a challenge. This isn't always fun, but you can make a huge difference with what you do. And I'm grateful to Mike, to Bob, to Susan, to Catherine for being part of this. And of course, we can't end one of these without thanking the staff of the ASAE Foundation and the staff of ASAE. We had several people who joined us today to help with administering the meeting, and we're grateful to all of them for what they do. So with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Andrea, who's going to close it out.